Welcome to the IDPro Show, your go-to source for exploring how to build and advance your career in digital identity. I'm Heather Flanagan, Executive Director of IDPro and Principal Editor for the IDPro Body of Knowledge.
And I'm Chris Cochran from AK Identity, and we're here to introduce you to the world of experts and in-depth discussions. Whether you're a seasoned pro or you're just starting your journey, this is your show to learn about the trends, knowledge, and career advice.
So we're here today to chat with Paul Figura, Chief Architect for Indigo Consulting. I mean, Paul's been active in the identity and access management space since 2008. He's worked on numerous implementations across lots of product suites and has experience in pretty much every major aspect of IAM, the authentication, authorization, IGA, all of it. He has spent many nights earlier in his career learning the whole dark art of identity management via product documentation, which is not the easiest way to do it, but it is obviously effective. Welcome, Paul.
So, like you said, that was my beginnings. I'm not the oldest identity practitioner, but I definitely feel like I joined right when things started to get exciting.
Well, rumor has it you actually started in app development, mostly mobile apps. So, how did you get to IAM from there? And what were the biggest challenges in making that shift?
Yeah, absolutely. So actually, I started off as a game developer doing mobile game applications, and from there, I did a lot of early J2ME and C++ Brew implementations. Uh, from there, I then joined a company that did like communications apps. So it was actually a startup, and it was all also J2ME, also a little bit of C sharp. Uh, but it was at that point where identity started to become a thing because all of these messages needed to be secured and needed to go to a particular server and have an identity for you who you're sending it to and who you are. And that's sort of where the whole identity and access management thing sort of started to click in my head. This was way before the days of OAuth though. So like I believe that was called Wireless Village, and I don't think anyone uses it anymore. But that's where it started. Maybe you recognize it. Um, but
Geez, Paul,
now,
how to date yourself without dating yourself.
yeah, well, there it is. So that was back then, and then from that moment on, I actually was contacted by the CEO of Indigo Consulting, and he asked me, "Hey, if you're getting tired of doing just plain old app dev like everyone else does, would you be interested in joining an identity and access management company?" Like, that's pretty interesting. I mean, it seems like there's a lot more challenges there than just like working on apps and games and things like that. So that's how I made the jump. I actually had no previous real identity and access management experience. I just jumped right in, and I remember one of the first things that hit me was that there really wasn't that big of a community around it at that point.
Mm.
So what happened was we would start at a client. I would be engaged there, and at the time everyone was traveling. Right, there was very little telecommuting or virtual offices. So I was traveling every week, going to a customer on site, essentially trying to learn everything I needed to do the night before, show up at the customer, pretend
Mhm.
like I'm the expert and that I know everything. When they ask me a question, I'd always be like, "Oh yeah, that's a really great question. Let me get
Yeah.
back to you." And then
Yeah.
go back to the hotel, spend all night researching that, come back with the answer and look like I really am the expert. And after a few iterations of that in a few months, I actually think I did become the expert that they
Yeah.
were expecting me to be. And I think a lot of us kind of had that trial by fire. Um, and that's how my particular case started.
I love it. That is awesome. It's those situations where you really have to focus and learn as fast as possible. But was there any concept that you just like had to beat your head against to figure it out? And what were some of the tools that you used to learn some of these concepts in such a fast time?
Yeah, I mean, some of the concepts that was always kind of a perennial thing that came back. And I wouldn't necessarily say for me, although it did take some time to really learn it. But like when you're talking about OAuth and OpenID Connect, trying to make sure that everyone understands all the different flows and where they're applicable, I still find that to be a challenge.
Hmm.
There's a huge like knowledge gap around that. And when you're talking with someone that's, again, like let's say a mobile dev, which is a really great example, who just wants to make their app work and they found a simple snippet online that makes their authentication work so easily and it's an implicit flow. Now you have to try and convince them actually that's not the best way to do that anymore, and you have to do this much more complicated flow that includes a few more API calls, but trust me, this is the way you want to do it. Whereas really they were happy before, and without having any of that knowledge, they would just stick on this less secure approach. And I've actually seen the whole gamut of people coding their own authentication just because they didn't really want to understand any of the standards, all the way to people that deep dive and over implement a standard, like looking at the Oasis spec for SAML and being really angry with a certain provider that doesn't give you exactly the right XML token in the right place, and like we'll try to open tickets about it for a product that has not really changed in many years. So in terms of challenges, that's the biggest challenge. Just making sure that the people I work with are all on the same level and understand the complexities of identity and access management and which place to use which standard.
I'm going to put a little rant in here because I just finished writing a document on short-lived tokens and why are short-lived tokens a very good thing. And I wanted to write it because I didn't know a lot about it, and I figured writing would be a really fantastic way to learn because that's personally how I learn. And so, having some experience in the space, the first thing I do is I'm like, well, tell me what the standards are. So I go to the IETF and I go through the RFC editor site and I do a search on tokens. And like one of the most promising thing that comes up is this thing called token binding. Token binding. That seems really interesting. It's got this great specification. It's very clear. Only if you had been in the conversations would you know that that's dead. No one's going to implement that anymore. But I can imagine a world where a person isn't heavily involved in standards development and therefore doesn't have any signal that that's not the right way to go.
Absolutely. And even using the right tools that are available, like for example, playing around with refresh token versus access token,
Mhm.
and then managing web sessions. These are three variables that I don't think most non-identity practitioners really think about, but each one of them plays a little bit of a role. So you have this web session that, if you're following the standard, then you can actually have a little app that runs and constantly pokes your service saying, "Hey, I'm still alive. I'm still alive." Uh, and then if that's working properly, you can then have your access token and have it refreshed with the refresh token continually, so it's always good. But the moment that that sort of breaks down, well, it's fine if the refresh token is very long lived. But if it's not, then you're going to force the user to re-authenticate. And you run into all these edge cases about what if there's an idle timeout and the idle timeout is longer than the session time. Like
Mhm.
I've seen the whole thing, and it actually gets really complicated until you put it down on documentation and really try to think it out.
Yeah, one of the reviewers for my paper asked a very good question. What is short?
Mm.
How should
Yeah.
can you give me the time frame? What is short versus what is long? And I'm like, well, that depends on your use case. I mean, it's a judgment call, and standards were not made for judgment calls.
Right.
It's super context dependent, and like without any context, I would tell people, okay, access token, I'd love it to be alive for minutes. And
Mhm.
then a refresh token, you could be a day or a week, depending on what you need. But even then, there's a lot of leeway. Like there's some applications that might need an access token that is good for 4 hours or 8 hours in a really bad case. I wouldn't recommend that, but I've seen like people justify it. And you really have to be able to work with that and just make sure that it fits the context.
So, I mean, I'm going to poke a little bit about your skills in terms of evaluating those products that haven't changed in years and may or may not implement the standard exactly the way it should be,
Oh,
but maybe they do something else. I mean, talking through someone who's interested in the field, how would you evaluate the strength and weaknesses of different solutions and products, and how would you advise others to be thinking about this?
So this is a really interesting question. I was actually thinking about like there's a difference between how I do it and how I would advise someone that doesn't have that much experience to do it, right? Because I've been around long enough. I know, let's say, a good 6 to 10 different products well enough that I could kind of look at them and say, okay, that's good for that. This one's better for that. But for a non-practitioner, the funny answer is I would probably tell, and this is almost like I almost don't want to say this, but I would tell them to look at some of the big ratings agencies like Gartner, Forrester, Kuppinger Cole, and like take a look at the reviews there because they're pretty good. There is some bias there because if you know how that all works, there's some money that's involved, but you do get some good reviews in terms of how the functionality works. And that gives you a starting point. From there, if you're really serious about trying to determine how these applications work, I would actually start by enumerating what you consider important. What are the features that you're trying to accomplish? And like literally list them down use case style. And the more you have, the better. And then just create a table and then do research for all the products that you're considering and do check marks. Does it do this? Does it do this? Does it do this? And then you'll start to create your own sort of view of what the products are able to do and not able to do. Obviously, to get there, you'll probably want to work with someone that has experience with it. So that's where maybe some consulting companies can come in and help you. If you're doing it all yourself, good luck to you. There's a lot of product documentation to read. You can do that, but it'll probably take months. That being said, it's feasible if you have the time and you don't have the money. Otherwise, you can look at Gartner reports if you have a lot of money, or the in between if you want to hire some consulting company to help you out and get a determination of what product to use.
Love it. Many moons ago, cybersecurity was like this big, very tight knit community, and it almost seemed like a lot of folks were leaning into the mystery of it all, the magical dark arts of cybersecurity. And you sort of alluded to that as well on the identity side, right? Very dark arts sort of situation. But as you've seen it grow and develop over the times, what are some of the big changes that you've noticed and have been most excited about in recent years?
So I'll start by the dark arts part because like I don't want to leave that on the side because there was a time where there was not so much information available.
Mhm.
We've had the internet for way longer than that, but there wasn't that much information about identity and access management in particular. And this is where some of this information that you needed to go dig deep dive into in vendor documentation at the time, some of it was good, some of it was terrible. But what I ended up finding, and this is where the dark arts part comes in, you would actually need to start developing your own little toolkit of shortcuts and cheat codes
Mhm.
that you would use for every place you went. So you would like literally, start doing an integration, let's say of some SAML integration, and you'd sort of start keeping tabs of, okay, this is the URL I used to invoke an IDP initiated flow. So then you'd save that URL and then you'd be able to reuse it in the future. And like every individual would build up their own repertoire of what they consider important to their toolkit, and that still happens today, but it was absolutely necessary in the past. And there was no good, like, let's say, forums where people would discuss and exchange information or ideas to kind of get a little bit more general knowledge. um, Now that's sort of changed. And for example, using the body of knowledge from IDPro was a fantastic place to get some of that base information. Communicating with, you can even rely on things like Stack Overflow to a certain extent. It helps. The IDPro Slack forums are fantastic if you want to have a huge discussion about something that you thought was utterly benign, and then all of a sudden you are 42, 42 replies into a long thread about zero standing privilege. Ask me how I know.
All right, I just want to say I didn't tell Paul to plug the Slack channel and the body of knowledge, but I'm really happy that he did.
I also have a little bit of a vested interest in IDPro. I've been a founding member since the thing started. So, anyways, I love it.
I love it. What advice would you give to somebody that's new coming into identity, right? You say you've been around since the beginning of IDPro, right? I love giving information to incoming technicians and cybersecurity practitioners, giving them little tools that'll help them on their way because their way could be very different than mine. They could go down different paths and do different avenues than I ever did. But I tried to give them as many tools as they could possibly have to hold and be able to make decisions. What tool or piece of advice would you give to someone entering into identity today?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in fact, it's a question that's quite quite pertinent to my day-to-day life. At Indigo Consulting, we're constantly hiring all sorts of people, but we also hire people straight out of university from time to time. And one of the first things I always bring up with these new hires is, hey, what have they taught you about LDAP in university? And the answer is
Oh, you're
always,
mean. You're
I
mean.
know, the answer is always, what's LDAP? Even if they're coming from strong programming or software engineering backgrounds, none of that generally gets touched. So that's usually where I start. I'll say, okay, these are the building blocks, the foundations of
Mhm.
identity and access management, if you will. So I'll mention LDAP and Active Directory. Uh, and then I'll mention some of the main protocols that we deal with. Okay, I'll ask them, what do they know about SAML? What do they know about XML? Quite frankly, because I don't think that even gets much of a talk these days in school. Then I'll bring up OAuth and Skin. And I like to start by the standards because once you get into product implementation specifics, you could really go down a really long path and spend a lot of time. But by starting the conversation with standards and the same kind of standards that would get talked about by the body of knowledge, you're kind of letting them start on an even playing field and start to understand the breadth of the whole field.
Mhm.
Because yes, any one of these subjects, you can deep dive so deep that you can't see the sky anymore.
Right.
But at least from a new practitioner's point of view, starting from breadth first, it makes it a little bit easier to enumerate the different things and start them on a plan to learn something. And then once they get that breadth first approach, I usually then kind of direct them towards one particular pillar and say, okay, now that you know the overall idea and you have a picture in your head, pick the thing that you want to focus on because otherwise it's too much. You can't generalize at the very beginning.
The starting at standards, I think, is so important. I can hear people, all the voices in my head. There are folks that do have the argument of, yes, but I want something practical. So if I just start
Mhm.
straight with this vendor's documentation, then I understand immediately how it's applied. And I think that's a bad idea because sure, you'll then understand that vendor, but that won't necessarily help you understand the next vendor or the next product or the next thing. If you understand the standard, by all means, then say, okay, well, this is how it's implemented here, but you've got that core neutral knowledge that's hugely helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And even between modern vendors today, I won't name any names, but there's like small changes between their OAuth implementation on what they consider the most important. Some vendors will consider the issuer as the truly most important thing in the token, and some vendors will consider the audience as kind of the most important thing. And then how the scopes are used is quite different between these vendors. And there's a few other custom claims that get put into tokens, if you know where you're looking, that become really important on a vendor specific implementation. And all that stuff is great, but if that's all you know, if you started on let's say an Auth0 implementation, then when you're going to build your system, you're just going to take for granted that all the claims that are appearing in these tokens are general and it's just OAuth or OpenID Connect stuff. But then if you try to switch to another vendor, oops, if you hard coded any of those things and you expected every single one of them to be there, guess what? You got some customization that you're going to be doing on the new vendor. And that's just the reality of it. Learning the specifications helps a little bit, but I'll be honest. I mean, I read the specification docs, and let's just say I have a friend that used to read his daughter the SAML Oasis specifications as a bedtime story because when she was like 1 year old, because it would put her to sleep in the monotonous way he was reading it almost instantly. So that sort of gives you an idea of the amount of excitement that you can get from a specification doc. But it does make a difference, and it is important to understand the intent that the authors were trying to come up with.
I have, in fact, heard a sleep story, that was, an elder British gentleman reading the introduction to the GDPR.
Oh my goodness.
So, you know what? I'm gonna say that your friend was a little bit twisted, but also not wrong.
No, no, not at all. And from personal experience, especially about that Oasis doc, I completely get it, and it's probably put me to sleep on more than one occasion as well. So
You talked a little bit about LDAP from back in the day, and we talked a bit about SAML, and then we're talking about OAuth, and now we're talking about OpenID Connect, and what we're talking about is an evolution of changes in the industry, and what was perfectly valid in 2008 doesn't always mesh particularly well with what's valid today. So, how have you kept your skills and knowledge up to date in this crazy, crazy industry? And are there any resources, in addition to the body of knowledge, of course,
the body of
that you
knowledge.
would recommend for ongoing learning?
Yeah, of course. We already mentioned one of the big ones. And of course, the CIDPro certification is one of the ones that we recommend in our company for all the architects and all the consultants coming up, because again, it's a good general base of knowledge. It brings you up to the state of the art. But but aside from that, uh, you really do benefit from, you know, reading implementation details that people publish online. Like there's actually quite a few like blogs that you can follow where people talk about kind of more modern problems and how they're achieving them. uh, Quite frankly, just doing little proof of concepts as well. I'm a pretty technical guy, and I really learn the best when I'm a little bit hands on.
Mhm.
So just trying to do and understand how a particular implementation or an integration would work, to just do it once in a very simple way kind of opens my mind and lets me stay up to date. um, and then really just staying in the community, because being able to talk with people, going to conferences, actually I didn't mention that, but that's super important. Going to conferences and being exposed to what other people consider important, I think it's probably the most beneficial thing for an identity practitioner today. Otherwise, you can very easily get locked in your bubble in whatever company you're working at and never really
Mhm.
go outside it. And like, if all you do is Microsoft, that's great, but you're never going to learn about some of the things that other companies are pushing, or even other standards. And like, you know, I've been talking a lot about, like you mentioned, LDAP, OAuth, SAML. There's also a lot of innovation going on around identity governance today, and a lot of big companies are trying to wrangle that and understand how to be compliant and all that stuff. And then the big one is authorization. I think that's probably where all the buzz is at the moment. I mean, like, you can consider identity and access management buzzworthy, but like, that's authorization is where people are quite excited about it. And I think there's still a lot of difficult challenges there that we have not solved yet. And just look at standards. We have some standards for authentication and federation. Cool. We have a standard for identity synchronization, which is SCIM. When it comes to authorization, we have five, six, seven standards. It's like that XKCD cartoon about, oh, that standard doesn't solve my problem, so I'll invent a new one and it's going to solve all the problems. Meanwhile, there's one more standard.
So I'm glad you touched on the concept of community, because community is huge. I mean, whether you're talking about science or you're talking about business, you're talking about identity, cybersecurity, community is really, really important. What has community meant to you? And is there a story that stands out in your mind about, what community has done for you in your career?
For me, I would say, like, my awakening with community was when I went to the first one. I think it was a vendor specific conference. It was a ForgeRock conference in the day, and like, that was the first time I was really surrounded and exposed to so many like-minded individuals. Just doing your work every day and delivering, and even reading and participating in online forums, that gets you here. But then meeting people in the flesh, having a drink with them, a beverage of choice, whatever it may be, and like really exchanging ideas one on one. that sort of changes a person, and it brings them to the next level. It kind of gets new ideas flowing. I remember the very first Identiverse. It was not Identiverse. It was CIS at the time. It was in Chicago. The very first Identiverse I went to. I was just sitting somewhere and chatting with some people. I didn't know who they were, but it turned out that one of the guys was a CTO of a very big company, and I was like, wow, this is incredible. Like in retrospect, maybe I should have asked them some better questions, but in the meantime, like it was cool, just being able to have that open conversation and exchange of ideas. So from that perspective, I think it's hugely important to be part of that community. And even if you can't afford to go to the big conferences, look around. There's always local conferences wherever you are. There's get-togethers. Even in Canada, in Montreal and Toronto, our company helps host some meetups for local identity professionals to go to. There's always identity and security conferences. Sometimes the cybersecurity conferences are not so great for identity practitioners, but there's always a little bit of identity there, or even actually a lot more than they like to think, quite frankly. And those conferences are also great places to learn and expand yourself.
Love it. So obviously we have a wide spectrum of folks that listen to the show, watch the show, people that have been in the game for a long time, and the folks that are just getting in, or even folks just thinking about coming into identity. If you had to lean in right now and talk to all those folks, whether you're talking about someone new or someone that's been a vet, what secret would you tell them right now to give them a leg up in their job?
What secret would I tell them to give them a leg up on the job? That's a great question. I would say the secret that I would tell them is don't be afraid to be wrong.
Mm.
I've found so many people that missed a really good opportunity, or didn't deliver something that they could have easily delivered just because they were trying to find the perfect solution.
Yeah.
I mean, if you can find the perfect solution, great, but perfect is the enemy of good enough.
Yep.
And look, we're in IT. We always have the ability to iterate and improve as we go along. So it's, generally speaking, even if your solution to deploy some sort of application is going to do an auth code flow, but you can't do Pixie, and there's something a little bit wrong about it, but it still works, it's generally a good idea to move forward, have a review and then correct it after the fact, than to stop progress until everything works perfectly, because you'll never deliver, and people will start to, not just have doubt in your team, but have doubt in like, hey, should we even be using OAuth? Maybe we should like create our own authentication system, and then a whole other problem begins to show up.
I love it. Paul, thank you so much for hopping on the mics with us today. Got to say thank you to everyone that's listening all the way around the world. Big thank you to AK Identity, and a huge thank you to IDPro. Be sure to get your membership at IDPro, whether you're talking about an individual or corporation, and get your CID Pro certification. I mean, that would be fantastic for anyone going into the world of identity and trying to make the most of their career. And with that, we will see everyone next time.